My name is Grady. I am an attorney. Born and raised in Chicago, grew up on the far south side. What I love about Chicago is the diversity of the people. I love our architecture, I love our lakefront, I love our history, I love sort of our mid-placement in the country. There are a lot of things I like about it. So even though we're diverse, we're highly segregated. Blacks live here, Latinx live here, white people live here, rich people live there, poor people live there. So it's this sort of strange mix in which we really don't mix. We're very balkanized, segregated, whatever the terms might be. So the ways in which I've interacted with the city have varied over my lifetime. You know, when I was a kid growing up and going away to college and law school, I really didn't have very much interaction with the city. Then of course I went to work for the city of Chicago in 1987 as the director of the Private Industry Council, working on the city's job training programs. And then later I was the zoning administrator from 1989 to 1995. And then I was the commissioner of buildings for a year after that. I also ran the Chicago Housing Authority for about a year. So during that time period, of course, I had great interaction with the city because I was a part of it. Since then, I've been on the other side of the table, representing private interests, property owners, developers, as well as some quasi-city entities. But most of my clients are either private sector or not-for-profits. I first started with the city in the zoning role in 1989 as zoning administrator. And just to put it into a little bit of context, that was back under the old zoning ordinance. And so a big part of my role was to try to take this zoning ordinance that actually was not working very well and trying to interpret it, help people through interpretations and assistance, which is sort of very difficult to do. There were a lot of ad hoc one-off decisions. There have been a lot of things that were handed down through precedent and practice that were never codified. There were no written regulations, but people kind of knew how to get things done. And it was a very inefficient system. So a big part of the job that I enjoyed was interacting with the community, with community groups, block clubs, organized community associations, aldermanic land use and planning review committees, as well as elected officials, primarily aldermen, but sometimes a state senator, a state rep, or somebody else. So I really enjoyed that part. At the more macro level, when you're talking about entrepreneurs, there really wasn't anybody at the desk to help people that didn't know what they were doing. The whole home occupations revolution was occurring during the time that I was zoning administrator. And so you had a lot of people who wanted to, start a business at their dining room table. And so they'd start that business and they'd scale up a little bit to a point where they were ready to get a loan from a bank, right? So they had a service or a product and they were kind of getting there. Well, the first thing that would happen is they'd go to the bank for a loan and they'd say, okay, fine, we have to get a business license. So they go over to City Hall to get a business license and they check the address and they'd say, you're in a residential zoning district. You cannot operate a business there. So then we passed a home occupations ordinance, which was, sort of, earth-shattering at the time. It's like, oh my gosh, as long as you don't have more than X number of people living there and you limit on, cars, you can't have heavy equipment, there calls for a big energy draw, et cetera, et cetera. At the time, that was sort of revolutionary, and now we take it for granted that people run small businesses from their home. So things I think are a little easier now. We've rewritten the zoning ordinance back in 2004, 2005 to accommodate more of those uses. But there's still a lot of bias against businesses in neighborhoods because a lot of people, they move into the bungalow belt or different parts of the city, and they want a quiet residential street. They don't want a lot of cars coming and going and people coming in for meetings and commercial vehicles parked there. Although now even that's changed with with Amazon and so much commerce being delivered by UPS and Uber and delivery services. So things have changed. Things have changed a lot. It's certainly easier for entrepreneurs now in many ways since the zoning ordinance has been updated. So when it comes to home occupations and the evolution, I think it's a matter of sort of when you reach that tipping point. All right. So let's take two examples. Let's say, Manny, you work for an architectural firm downtown, but you can work from home. The business is located downtown. And then 5 of you are an independent architect, starting your own architectural firm. Same equipment that Manny has, all right, doing similar work, but you've got to get a business license. And so you are regulated. But now let's say you grow and you need to hire some people, right? You need an administrative person. You want to bring on a couple of junior architects. You need some larger scale equipment. And to do that, you need electrical upgrade because it takes 220 instead of 110. Well, now you're going to run into trouble because your needs exceed what the current ordinance will allow. So some would say, well, fine, then you should change the ordinance to accommodate 5E's growing architectural business up until a certain point. Well, what's that point, right? We say, well, none of my employees drive cars, so it's not like people are going to complain because there are a lot of cars on the street. But then you need to have clients come in to meet with you occasionally, right? So you have a surveyor come, you have other architects, you have your clients, you have an engineer, you have an attorney or whatever. Well, now all of a sudden, like your dining room is no longer a dining room, now it's a conference room, and on and on. And now the people who live upstairs are complaining because they're like, you know, people, right? And so I don't have the answer, but the issue becomes, at what point do you really outgrow the scale and scope and aesthetic of a residential neighborhood? So when it came to the balance we were trying to achieve with that early home occupations ordinance in the late 80s or early 90s, here were the forces. So we worked closely with the Women's Business Development Center, and they needed some of the changes that we were putting in place. And then we were speculating in terms of, well, how many employees is too many employees, right? And the other concerns that I mentioned with, you know, electrical overload and cars parking and package delivery, and the other push was coming from some of the aldermen, some of the next door neighbors, some of the block clubs who were saying, no, this is a residential street. We don't want those. We don't want businesses here. We had the push from the kind of pro-entrepreneurial community, and we had the pull from many of the aldermen, as well as some of the block clubs and surrounding property owners. The issue of accessory dwelling units, some would call them granny flats, some are in coach houses, some are in attics. Now we have a shared housing ordinance. You've got Airbnbs. There's a long history, and it's had lots of different names. One of the issues that I faced when I was zoning administrator was some bungalows, some regular single-family looking houses on some streets. They would pack people in to basically like little cages in the basement. Some of the people were undocumented workers in the city, and they had sort of a sponsor, and they were basically just sort of hiding out, kind of living below the threshold. And what would happen is when people on the block would find out about those, then they would complain. And then they would be shut down because they were violating the building code in terms of the number of people living in a building. Sometimes they had engaged in construction without a permit, and some of the conditions were just unsafe. And so we had to deal with that. The more modern issues you're seeing are with Airbnbs. In my condominium, just as an example, we outlawed Airbnbs. And that's happened in a lot of buildings because they don't want a transient population coming and going. And then we have the shared housing ordinance, which limits the number of shared housing units in a building. There's also been a big change with condominium deconversions, and so many of the new residential buildings being constructed as rental, as apartment buildings, and not as condominiums. And so a lot of people don't want to purchase a property. They don't want the big mortgage. They don't want to be tied to a piece of real estate. And so things generally are sort of a little more transient, both in a lot of condominium buildings as well as rental buildings. So we've gone from these illegal conversions, where I mentioned you have many people living in a building, or sometimes it's just a more of a normal deconversion where it's a single family home and they cut it into 2 units or maybe 3 units. And then we've got the Airbnbs and now the bigger shared housing. So it's sort of a continuum, and the city is always in a reactionary mode, reacting to change in the marketplace. It's difficult to plan for those changes because you don't really know what they're going to be. The entire issue of planning versus reacting is, to me, a bit of a riddle. When I was a member of the Chicago Plan Commission, I got in trouble with the administration once because I said at a public meeting that we shouldn't call it the Department of Planning, we should call it the Department of Reaction, okay? Because it was my perspective at the time that that's what the city was doing. At the same time, the city has done planning in a lot of different ways, and I'll give you a couple of examples that relate. So let's talk about daycare centers downtown, and let's talk about industrial retention policy and planned manufacturing districts. So I remember back in the early 90s when daycare centers first wanted to come downtown. You would have thought that we were taking the whole American culture and dream and throwing it out the window. People are like, what impact is it going to have on their development? And they're going to get run over by cars, and they're going to be kidnapped, and they're going to get caught in fires in buildings downtown. We have had a couple of fires in buildings downtown, but let's face it, they're pretty far and few between. But the first hearing for a daycare center in downtown Chicago before the Zoning Board of Appeals for special use went on for about four or 5 hours. Now we're just like, well, where's the daycare center? You know, what's the closest daycare center to my office? And oh, there's not one in my building. Well, let me talk to my employer about that. You know, I gotta go 2 blocks for the daycare center for my kid. You know, what's wrong with this city? So daycare centers in downtown office buildings are de rigueur now, right? And they're, you know, I'm sure there are security issues, but we've become accustomed to those things, and we've built them in, and now they're sort of very standard. So, industrial retention and planned manufacturing districts. Again, I recall when the city adopted the first planned manufacturing district up around North and Clybourne, and then they went on to pass, I think we have 17 or 18 planned manufacturing districts now. Well, now that the whole industrial landscape has changed in the city with an overall decline in manufacturing, a change in that industry overall, and a more demand for more retail and more housing and more commercial use, now we're changing and we're eliminating a lot of those regulations, which at the time would have been anathema to the city's economic development. I mean, now we focus much more on, can we bring the next, well, Amazon HQ2, we didn't get it, but right? Can we fill up the post office with service employees, right? So you've got Uber Freight going in there, and Walgreens, and on and on. You've seen the development there. And all of those are white-collar service jobs. I mean, 90+% of them, right? I mean, somebody's in there, they've got photocopiers and stuff like that, but that's not even sort of really industrial, be sort of service industrial light. So we've moved from an industrial retention policy towards an office service economy that we want to bolster. So the whole issue of the population decline in the city and in the state is a very serious one. I mean, first at a political level, in the next census decennial next year, it's anticipated that the state of Illinois will lose 1, if not 2, congressional seats. And that decline will also result in a significant reduction in the federal funds that we receive through many, many programs. As you're probably aware, many federal programs, the money is doled out based solely upon the population. It's one thing if we lose people that are living in the city and they move to the suburbs. It's another thing if they move away. And importantly, it's another thing if they don't move here to begin with. A lot of those folks are finding jobs in other places. We're losing population in the city and in the state, and that hurts us at a lot of levels. It also is resulting in our economy being a lot less diverse. We've lost a lot of the manufacturing jobs. Yes, we're making it up in a lot of the service jobs, but that also hurts because we don't have a lot of sort of real middle class workers. We have a lot of people earning comparatively high salaries, and we have a lot of people, making sort of minimum wage and just above. The middle class is basically largely gone from the city, and it's replaced with either high-income earners or low-income earners, and that really hurts the city at a number of levels. The biggest spend in the city budget is for your tax dollar is for public education. And then from there it goes to police and fire. A lot of people don't focus on that. They say, oh, the city budget, they think of people working at City Hall. And although there are a lot of workers there, the big chunks of the budget are in education and public safety, police and fire. So the city is in a bit of a bind on the financial end and also on the perception of political corruption and the impact that that has on business. I think the growth of small business is very important, and the city and the state and the federal government need to do everything they can to promote the growth of small businesses. Some of the statistics indicate that that's really where a tremendous amount of job growth comes from. We tend to focus on, the big businesses. Uber Freight's coming and they're going to bring 2,000 jobs over the next 5 years. Well, that's terrific. How many small businesses will create more than 2,000 jobs in aggregate over the next 5 years? A lot more. But we put the emphasis, it's very sexy, it's very romantic, it gets big headlines. They enter into a big lease for space, which is great. I'm not saying it should be either or, we actually need both. But there needs to be equal attention to the growth of small businesses and doing what you can to promote that. Now, the city has done work in that area through their neighborhood opportunity funds and some other grant programs to encourage small businesses. But I think you can sort of never do enough to encourage small business growth. And they face a lot of unique factors. But you're right. I think the bottom line there is you will ultimately get a lot more jobs through supporting small businesses than you will through some of the home runs that get all the media attention. With regard to some great changes to make to the zoning ordinance, simplifying it would be very, very helpful. And a couple of ways that I think they could simplify it have not so much to do with the content of the code in terms of, the minimum lot area or the floor area ratio or your setback requirements or your off-street parking requirements, but the processes that you have to go through in order to get your approvals. For example, the Zoning Board of Appeals meets once a month. It's an all-day meeting, and 85 to 90% of the cases are approved. Well, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could have an administrative process where city staff could review your application and say, what are the types of cases that commonly get approved? All right, we're going to, all of those types of cases, we're going to put into the administrative process. They review your application. If there's no objection from the neighbors or the aldermen or community groups, they'll approve it. And then they can save the hearings for the Zoning Board of Appeals for the big cases, right? But you could have a system I'm describing where you could literally take a majority of the cases that the Zoning Board of Appeals hears, have a staff person review it, and you're done. And then the ZBA could focus on the truly impactful land uses where there is some controversy. And you could do some of the same with some of the plan developments, some of the cases that the Plan Commission has to hear. So to accomplish some of those things, you'd actually have to hire more staff. Maybe people would be willing to pay. Say, fine, if I don't have to go to the Zoning Board of Appeals, I'm happy to pay an extra $500 if I can get this done. Something that happens in Chicago on projects is, we have a tradition. And that is, you talk to the adjoining property owners, you talk to the block club if there is one, and you talk to the local community organization, and you talk with the alderman. For example, with the our loss of the Lucas Museum, the approach that was taken on that project was top down. The mayor announced that it was going to happen, and here's where it was going to be, and this is what it was going to be, and then there was all this fallout. So imagine this, and I don't know if Mr. Lucas has the personality to do this or not, but imagine if George Lucas had gone to community, they had set up a series of community meetings, right? And he said, hi, I'm George Lucas. You probably know me through Star Wars. He would have had them eating out of their hands. He wouldn't even have to talk about the museum. He could have said, let me tell you about when I came up with Obi-Wan Kenobi. So I'm sitting there, and then they say, "Oh, all right. Well, tell us about, how'd you come up with Darth Vader?" I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you get the point. There are some basics for land use and zoning approvals in Chicago. Be respectful. Talk to people. Listen to people. Be willing to modify your project. Allow ample time for input and collaboration. And even if you don't want to change it, give the appearance that you're willing to consider changes, and see. Also, they really didn't talk much about the economic development impact there. kind of as it relates to real people, and how does that fit into the whole overall museum campus and all that. It was more, this is where it's going to be, this is what it's going to look like, boom, take it or leave it. And the people in Chicago said, leave it. You know, at a number of levels, the city is doing great, right? I mean, there are several dozen cranes in the air. We have a lot of new office buildings on Wacker and over in Fulton Market. The South Loop continues to be built out. You know, there are a lot of very good things going on in the city that are attracting people and keeping people here at a certain level. At the same time, the bottom's falling out because we've lost, you know, we keep losing population. And the population that we're losing is actually not the very poor. We're losing the population that has enough means to be mobile. They can live wherever they want. And a lot of those people are moving, right? They're moving to the south suburbs. A lot of black families are moving to the south suburbs and the western suburbs. A lot of Latinx families are not in the city. They're moving out of the city to Aurora and all kinds of other places. And we're missing that. We're missing that middle, and it's key. And that's really going to be, I think, an Achilles heel for the city going forward, because we need to attract those families. People are voting with their feet, and they're moving away, or they're not even coming here. They're migrating to other places that are viewed as more livable, and some of which are even more affordable. And it's unfortunate because we've got a great city with a wonderful lakefront, dynamic civic amenities, whether you're into classical music or the lyric, or you're into the Worldwide Federation of Wrestling out at the Rosemont Rising, or the Bulls or the Cubs or the Bears or whatever. We just have a lot to offer in Chicago. And the trick is to balance it out and to continue to attract middle-income families to stay and live in the city.